in this hour, we dig deep, we go behind those headlines, and we bring you the stories people are talking about. And for the last couple of days, the entire Los Angeles community and surrounding communities have really been rocked by the shooting death of 15-year-old Ryan Gaynor. Uh, Body camera footage from the two officers who were involved in his shooting death have the footage has been released, and what we've been able to see on that footage is quite frankly horrifying. Uh, so many questions about why two police officers would shoot and kill a 15-year-old unarmed boy. He was holding a garden tool in his hand. Uh, the, from the reports in the media, his family or someone in his family called the police because Ryan was acting perhaps erratically. They thought maybe his behavior was aggressive, but his father apparently was able to calm him down. And another relative called the police to say, "We don't need you. It's okay. We have it under control." But by then, the police had already been dispatched. They show up. There's seemingly very little conversation with the family or Ryan. They say that he charged at one of the police officers. And rather than do anything to de escalate the situation, it looks like both officers shot, or at least from what we've been told, perhaps both officers shot him. And we could hear in this body cam footage and video his mother or some woman screaming, "Why did you shoot my baby?" You can only imagine the horror, the pain, the trauma that a family would experience after calling the police and then calling them to say, "Don't come." They show up anyhow. And in minutes, this 15-year-old boy is dead. He is shot. He is killed in front of his family. And as an autism advocate, as a founder of an autism organization, and as a civil rights attorney, and a mother of a young man on the autism spectrum, this case is so incredibly personal for me. So many of my friends, parents from around the country have been reaching out, everyone just expressing just complete horror at what happened with 15-year-old Ryan. When we come forward, we're going to talk to a psychiatrist and a behavior certified interventionist about the behavior that Ryan may have been exhibiting on this day. What should the police response have been, and how do we make sure that families never, ever, ever have to experience what this family experienced with regard to the shooting death of their son? Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580. And in this hour, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Helena Hansen. She is a psychiatrist and interim chair of psychiatry and biobehavioral science at UCLA Geffen School of Medicine. And Marcos Aguilar is here. He is a behavior certified behavior analyst, and director of clinical services at Special Needs Network, the nonprofit that I founded some years ago after my own son, Marty, was diagnosed with autism. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Hansen, for joining me. Marcos is going to join us a little later. But I don't know, when you heard about this story, what was your initial response?
Well, I was horrified and deeply saddened. I'm also a mother of a child who meets criteria for autism spectrum disorder. She's a young Black woman. She's not a young Black man. And this is yet another case of being a Black man in this country being, a lethal condition. And so this is just sadly too common. It's a very common situation.
And you say that, Dr. Hansen, and I don't think people really recognize how young Black kids, and men in particular, are adultified, and how society sees them, even when they're kids, even when they're teens. They see them as men. And we know that Black men have been stereotyped as menacing and violent. And that has to play into the mindset when police officers arrive at the scene, when they are engaging and interacting with our community, because the reality is we don't see unarmed white teenagers being shot in front of their parents in their homes in Beverly Hills or Holmby Hills or Bel Air or, affluent parts of Los Angeles. So, we can't dismiss the issue of race and implicit bias and how that plays into so many of these tragedies. But I do want to talk about some of the reporting in the media about what Ryan was doing. So we learned from the media that he was on the autism spectrum. I also read today that the police have been called out to the home about 4 or 5 other times that for behavior that Ryan was engaged in. Help us understand, you know, why a 15-year-old kid may be engaged in some kind of behavior that would warrant calling the police.
So, I want to come back to the framing that you just gave. It's just absolutely supported in every study that's ever been done that young Black boys, men are criminalized at very early ages. They're much more likely to be sentenced as adults for any crime they may have committed and be held accountable for behavior that often could be attributable to a developmental disorder or mental health problem. So that, the evidence is there. He fits that. On the other hand, the complexity of this case and the real, sadness of it, my heart goes out to the family. They were trying to get help. And some children with autism spectrum disorders show features of what we call aggression. They may have impulse control issues. They may not be able to stop themselves if they have the impulse to act out in a physical way. And it sounds from the reporting that I've gotten, I don't have any more detail than you have, but it sounds as though the family felt that he was out of control physically and they were trying to get help. And that is so natural for a family to try to get help. And to me, the problem is clearly they didn't have a way to get help. Another thing that we know is that Black families are so much less likely to have access to quality mental health care and quality assistance with children who have developmental delays. So clearly they did not have the resources that they needed at baseline. If they had had quality mental health care and the help of a pediatrician, a therapist, a psychiatrist who could help them to anticipate and de-escalate this kind of behavior, there are tried and true techniques to use with children who have autism spectrum disorder. Clearly, they didn't have access to that. Then once they get in a situation where they feel acutely threatened because he is out of control, they should not have had to call the police. They should have had another resource. And so there have been proposals on the table. There's a 988 alternative hotline for mental health problems. It's not working the way it should. They may have tried them before. And my understanding is that there are very long wait times for that alternative to police mental health crisis hotline. So we need to look at the systemic structural problem here. Why do families like his not have the resources that they need? I think that's what we're seeing.
No, it's such a great point. And we know that without knowing this family, without having interviewed them, without having interacted, because if the media reports are accurate, they've called the police, previously 4 or 5 times, which says they didn't have a way of addressing his behaviors. They didn't have, a way to calm him down, and they didn't have any other alternative other than the police. And that's, you don't want to use the police in a situation like this where there's a kid on the spectrum who, doesn't have a gun, doesn't have a knife, doesn't have any kind of, deadly weapon, but yet we know in too many encounters with Black kids and police, they end up dead, they end up shot. I was on an interview myself this morning, and a question from someone who was listening in was, why would Ryan, because one of the reports in the news is that he wanted to play his iPad or play with his iPad or listen to his music, and his parents wanted him to do his chores first. So the question came up, like, why would your parent telling you to do your chores cause you to become agitated? Can you help people understand that about kids on the spectrum and the whole notion of routine and how being thrown off a routine can cause sometimes these kind of aggressive behaviors?
Thank you. Well, your question reveals you have a lot of knowledge of this already. As a parent of someone with autism spectrum disorder who is 24 now and recognizes that she needs routines and imposes them herself, as you said, part of the syndrome for many children is that they have to have predictability and they get their mind set on one course of action. And if someone tries to interrupt that course of action, it can very easily make them agitated. And then on top of that, the impulse control issues. And so, it's called developmental delay for a reason, in that we're talking about children and young adults who haven't mastered certain kinds of skills that their peers, that we expect from somebody their age. So sometimes the behavior can look like the behavior of someone many years younger than the person in front of us. That is why it's called developmental delay. It's uneven. So many people with autism spectrum disorders have incredible skills in certain areas, just amazing analytical skills or recall, things that I can't match, but then they have other areas where they're not anywhere near their peers and they just need a lot more support and time to catch up. So he may have been, I can't comment on him because I don't know him at all. I don't know the specifics, but there are many young people with autism spectrum who, like you said, if they're interrupted in the middle of a routine or they get their minds fixated on something, they can be very rigidly focused on that, like a younger child might be, someone much younger than him. And if they're interrupted, then that makes them very agitated. Their way of handling it is to act out physically like a much younger child would. And so that's what I am inferring. But again, I don't know the case. I don't know him personally.
Right. And one of the things that you and I've talked about before, and I know Special Needs Network, my nonprofit, is really focused on is this comorbidity, the reality out there that by some statistics, 70% of people on the autism spectrum having some comorbid, meaning co-occurring condition with their autism, whether it's anxiety, depression, ADHD. Speak to us about that and help us understand. One of the questions this morning was, is autism a mental health condition? Where does it fall as you think about how we classify conditions in this country?
So, the diagnosis of autism continues to shift, and the scientific basis that we use to label it as one diagnosis and fit different people under that diagnosis continues to shift as we learn more, the literature changes. But what you're saying is absolutely true. There's a distinct pattern that people who meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder, for that diagnosis, if they can be diagnosed with that, they're so much more likely to be diagnosed with a host of other conditions, including ADHD, which makes it even harder for them, for example, to control their impulses. Impulsivity is a big piece of this. So if they have attentional disorder, that makes it even harder for them. And it just compounds, makes it much more difficult problem. But with proper supports, we have well-tested, tried and true techniques that can be very helpful. And so I can speak from personal experience because my 24-year-old is not the person I knew even 2 years ago. She has made huge strides. It's just that it's happened later in her life. The term developmental delay is considered a developmental condition because the children can learn these skills and catch up. So I think it's so important the work that you are doing in raising awareness about autism as a disorder, especially among Black families where it's often misunderstood. My own child was diagnosed very late, even though I'm a psychiatrist, because, first of all, she doesn't fit the stereotype. So maybe even I fell into that. She's a Black girl. The majority of people who are diagnosed are white boys. There's a very distinct stereotype of who has autism, right? So she was diagnosed very late. I was a very frustrated parent. And it took some outside perspectives of my colleagues to pull me aside and say, listen, this is what I think might be going on. So this happens to the best of us. And it's really important to bear in mind, like you said, that it also not only is it a disorder with distinct treatments and approaches that can be very helpful. I hesitate to say disorder because my daughter, as a young adult, is now saying, Mom, I don't know if this is a disorder. I think it's a personality style, right? And I give her that credit. We don't necessarily need to see it as a disorder because many of these young people have incredible talents and skills, and they can really excel in their lives. And there's now a movement for them as young people to call themselves neurodivergent. They have a different way of being in the world than many of us, but that doesn't make it any less than. I do subscribe to that point of view, but it also means that there are very, very concrete things that can be done to help them succeed. And often, like you said, it goes along with other things like ADHD that can also be addressed with therapy, with medication, with lots of helpful techniques.
And I applaud your daughter and congratulations and, kudos to her for the development that she is now exhibiting and, having this sense of self-awareness. But I worry if autism, and particularly those who have more profound, what we call more profound autism, is as a lot of self-advocates, and a lot of these self-advocates are white
Mhm.
males
Mhm.
who are rejecting the treatment of autism, who are rejecting the label of autism. If we want police officers, if we want society, if we want community to learn about autism and to be responsive in a way that when, if you're the police officer, you don't show up with a gun. And if we reduce it to a personality difference, does that worry you? That kind of
Yeah,
bothers
no,
me.
I see what you mean, because there are some distinct advantages over having it criminalized. Because what we're seeing in this young man's case is he was criminalized. It was just assumed that he was apparently he was going after these officers with a gardening tool, I have to say, police officers are not trained to respond in a sensitive way. Everything about their job, everything about their training, first of all of the racist stereotypes that heighten their sense of danger and need to defend themselves, make them very trigger happy. I don't think we're going to go very far in making police officers the ones responsible for responding to mental health crises. And I agree with you that we need to have a designation. The reality of our society is we have to have a designation of mental health disabled in some way, or some kind of disability, in order to protect our young people from a police.
Because think about this, Dr. Hansen. If an officer already, as you said, trained to defend themselves, not protect and serve, but defend themselves, if they're already trigger happy, and if they get, it in their brains, like they have it in their brains that Black men are dangerous, if they think people with autism just have a personality disorder, I mean,
So let me put this in
perspective.
perspective. No, I think you're so right. Let me put this in perspective. I think that no two people with autism are the same, and it is a spectrum, right? And it can be very helpful to some young people to be seeing what they have as a useful thing in some way. It's a part of them, and they can use it to their own advantage. That doesn't mean, though, that we have to dispense with this as a mental health condition or a disability. I do think we need the protections. We need the protections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We need the protections of this is a mental health condition, therefore police are not the appropriate response team. So, for example, the 988 alternative to police, it's fallen short. It's underfunded. The response timer is hours. If you have a child.
Is that system up and running? Can you call 998 today, or it's defunct?
So apparently it has been enacted, and it here in Los Angeles, and the response times can be several hours. That's not going to work because it's underfunded, understaffed. The ultimate goal is to have mental health professionals respond instead of police. The secondary, until we get there, the secondary goal would be to have mental health trained people accompany police to calls that are acute in nature, where there's some kind of physical acting out or someone feels threatened, to at least have mental health trained people accompany police so that they can be involved in de-escalation. That hasn't happened to the extent that it needs to. If you have a son with autism who is attacking people with a gardening tool simply because he hasn't learned how to control his emotions and he's acting out physically, you can't necessarily wait 4 hours.
No.
A mental health support team. So for that to be a reasonable alternative, we have to have it funded and staffed.
Yeah, you can't wait 4 hours for the 998 people to respond. And this example shows us you should not and cannot call the police and expect that to, end well. I know we're out of time with you, Dr. Hansen. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and talking about this really important issue. Obviously, it's not going away, unfortunately. Such a tragedy, but at least we can talk about it.
Thank you for doing this work and this reporting. It's so important.
Absolutely. When we come forward, more about the case of 15-year-old Ryan Gaynor, who was shot by police, and what could have been done by healthcare professionals. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580. And as you heard the psychiatrist in the earlier segment, Dr. Hansen, say that the police are not the people to call when a kid or teen on the autism spectrum is exhibiting aggressive behaviors. And I wanted to bring onto the show today a board certified behavior analyst. His name is Marcos Aguilar. He's actually the clinical director at the nonprofit that I run, Special Needs Network. and he has worked with individuals on the spectrum for over 10 years. And really want to talk in this segment, Marcos, about what kinds of things could have been done, what kind of interventions, because Dr. Hansen and I both are speculating that this family didn't have this kind of support, the safety net that was needed to help them, manage their son's behavior. And Ryan himself didn't have the tools. So welcome to the show and talk to us about the kinds of skills that someone like you, who's a board certified behavior analyst, what kind of skills and techniques would you have been, if you had a client like Ryan, what would you have taught him if you knew he had impulse control issues, if he was prone to outbursts, if he had difficulties making transitions?
First and foremost, thanks for having me, Areva. And it's important to dissect the occurrence of what transpired here. And when I was looking at the footage that was, and I believe the version that I saw was the edited version, right? So I didn't get to see the full unedited version that was released out to the public. But what I did see the law enforcer do is he arrived to the home and immediately walked it to the door. He didn't assess the situation. He didn't call out for family. He didn't call out to see if everyone was okay. He walked immediately to the door and put himself in a situation that could have posed himself at risk, but at the same time, didn't take time to acknowledge the situation. As a parent or as a professional in this field, what I would have worked with Ryan is to help teach him how to ask for additional time or to ask for accommodations when those accommodations could be made, right? And right now, I would hate to be in his family's shoes because they're probably thinking all the things they could have done that unfortunately led to this tragic event. And I hope that they're not blaming themselves because it looks like they had some success with law enforcement in the past. And it's unfortunate here that it didn't occur in the way that it did occur in the past. So definitely it's important for families to seek behavioral support, to seek what alternatives can be done to help a child communicate when they want adjustments to be made, what a child can do to cope with situations that may not be preferred for them. Right, but here in this situation, the police officer did a horrible job in assessing the situation and quickly responded in a very aggressive manner. And if I'm sure you saw the video too, Areva, I'm sure you saw the officer screaming right away. And the first thing he did, and one of the first actions he did, was reach for a deadly weapon in this instance.
Yeah, let's stop there for a minute, Marcos, and talk about the yelling that the police was doing. We know oftentimes police, they show up on a scene, and you're right, they don't take a lot of time to assess the situation. Oftentimes these shootings happen within seconds of them arriving. And in this case, this officer is yelling at Ryan. And we know an individual, a teen on the autism spectrum could have a lot of sensory. Again, we don't know Ryan. We haven't assessed him. He hasn't been a patient that we have had in our clinical setting, but we do know that oftentimes kids with autism, teens with autism, have a lot of sensory issues, and loud noises can be a trigger for them. So what can happen if a teen on the spectrum does have sensory issues and someone approaches them and starts yelling and shouting commands at them? For me, I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know if Ryan even could comprehend what the commands were, and he clearly wasn't given enough time to try to respond to the command. So talk to us about that, this whole yelling piece of this video, which is so disturbing.
Areva, I couldn't understand the commands, right? It was difficult for me myself to understand the commands. And if I was having issues understanding the commands through footage, I could just imagine what poor Ryan was going through. He's already in a state of escalation. At this moment in time is moving back, it's assessing the information, is typically where we're in a state of high escalation. What we would do is wait and acknowledge when the time to start providing instructions is visible. Here, the officer started to provide very quick instructions, very loud instructions that I believe Ryan was unable to understand or comprehend at this moment in time. And typically in a situation where a child is already escalated and has a history of aggressive behaviors, you wait for a sign where they show signs of de-escalation, breathing, responding to some instructions, whether it be from caregivers or law enforcement assistance. And it doesn't look like the officer gave Ryan a chance to respond. And another thing that I also saw too, Areva, is the way he moved back, right? I believe there was an option for him to go left, for him to go right, as Ryan was charging towards him. And the officer runs back and puts himself in an even more dangerous situation. So the officer here needs to have better training. There needs to be better training on how to move when someone is charging at you with a garden tool here. It's not a weapon, right? It doesn't look like the officer's life was in danger in any way, shape, or form. And to result to shooting a child, because that's what he is. He is a child. He's a 15-year-old child in front of his family. Is just it's just unfortunate, and it's a tragic event for family. Is a tragic event for the neighbors that were present there. I believe one of the neighbors was also interviewed and said that the young man would talk to him and his daughter, was very kind. So it's a loss for not just for this family, but also for the community in itself.
And one of the things too, Marcos, that we learn, or at least I read in one of the reports that I read today, was that the father had at some point been able to calm Ryan down. And clearly, the police don't live there 24/7, or didn't live there 24/7. So there must have been periods when perhaps Ryan would get aggressive, and the family did have some way of calming him down. What are some of the common techniques that you use as a board certified behavior analyst with an individual, a young kid or a teen that has aggressive behaviors? What are some of the things that you would typically tell a family to do at home if they have, someone that's acting aggressive?
Is what I typically ask families to do is not to reach their level of volume, right? And I don't know what behaviors Ryan exhibits. I don't have a behavior intervention plan for him, so it's really hard for me to understand what his escalation looks like, or what the escalation for him specifically looks like. But what I typically tell my families and our colleagues where we don't have a behavior intervention plan in place for them, is we have to wait, acknowledge the situation. We have to provide instructions when a child or individual isn't in a elevated state of mind, so that we can start to provide instructions and start to hopefully de-escalate the situation. It's difficult to provide interventions for someone who doesn't have a behavior intervention plan. And police officers don't have a behavior intervention plan, but what police officers do need is enhanced training on how to deal with these situations. Because it's not going to be the last time where a police officer is called to an event like this, right? And for some families, and for Ryan's family, it looks like they had success in the past. Right? So why wasn't there a profile on him? Why wasn't that when they pulled up that address, says child with autism lives here, or with there's a history of escalation here with this child? Something to identify there's a child that may be going through a crisis moment at this moment in time, and for there not to be lethal force used. So there's definitely needs to be change. How many more events need to happen for something like this to occur? I have no idea, right? Because law enforcement has the funds. They have the funds to make profiles. They have the funds to train individuals. I do think that law enforcement also needs to interact with behavioral health specialists on trainings to learn how to de-escalate situations like this. They need to obtain training on non-lethal methods, on how to de-escalate not just children, but individuals with autism, individuals with behavioral needs. Because it doesn't look like that happened here, and it's unfortunate to get to this point.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. About the communication or the lack thereof, and given the number of times that law enforcement have been called by this family, you would expect that information would have been communicated. The information that this is not a kid with a gun, this is not a criminal, this is not someone who is dangerous, this is someone who may be having an episode but there are ways to calm him down. There's ways to transition him, to de-escalate him, and to, create a sense of calm in that house. And then you have to wonder, like, okay, if they've called the police 4 or 5 times, where are the mental health professionals? Where are the social workers? Where are the school district that's, should be providing resources? It just pains me that a family is having to call the police so often. It says, as we talked about a little earlier, there isn't a good safety net in place. We don't know if this kid was in therapy, getting services, had a behavior plan, but chances are the answer to that would be no. And if the answer is yes, then obviously those providers were failing him, because our teens, our kids, our young adults, the way to deal with their behaviors is not by getting law enforcement involved. Because as much as you talked about what law enforcement should have done, the reality is most police officers don't have that training, and they are ill-equipped to know, and they could be afraid. Unfortunately, many of them may be afraid. We know that there are people who are afraid of our population, who are afraid of people with autism. They shouldn't be, but they are. There's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. When we come forward, I want to continue talking about how a family would go about getting these kinds of services and developing the kind of behavior plan that you talked about. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580. We're back, and we're talking about this horrific shooting of Ryan Gaynor, a 15-year-old kid on the autism spectrum. His attorney has also issued a statement saying, the attorney for the family, I should say, saying that the sheriffs had information on him. They had been to the house several times. They knew, or should have known, how to interact with him. The attorney also believes, like we believe, Marcos, that this officer was not in danger of his life. He wasn't in any imminent danger, and that he should have put, as you've talked about so eloquently, time and space in between themselves and Ryan. I just don't understand why they would just rush into a house, start shouting commands, and when the kid doesn't respond immediately, your first impulse is to pull out a gun and start shooting. Just inappropriate on so many levels. But how would a family get the behavior plan that you've talked about? Again, we don't know if Ryan's family had one. We do know, as Dr. Hansen said, that getting autism services can be very challenging, particularly for families in underserved communities. Black and brown families struggle oftentimes to get diagnoses, are often diagnosed 3 to 4 years later than their white peers, and then struggle to access services. So assuming that Ryan could access some services, talk to us about what that would look like, the evaluation process, and then getting this behavioral plan in place.
So what a family can do, Areva, is they can go to their primary care physician. I've had adults even themselves tell me that, who have access ABA services later down the road, right? Maybe they've passed childhood and now they're adults, and they seek, I need support for my behavioral management. What they can do is go to their primary care physician, seek a referral for an evaluation from a professional behavioral provider. And what then they'll do is they'll evaluate, right? And the family or the person themselves can request for the evaluation to be done in home, to be done in a place of work, to be done in an educational setting, according to where their specific needs are. And that's typically the process that a lot of the families that we service here at SNN take to receive services. Another way is seeking different opinions. On some occasions, you'll be told that you don't have a diagnosis, but definitely seeking the opinion of 3 to 4 professionals to make sure that you're making a choice that you know it's going to be beneficial, not just for yourself, but for your family as well.
And once you get that diagnosis, what's typically in a behavioral plan? Like, again, we're talking about Ryan Gaynor because this is the horrific shooting case, but for any teen that has some aggressive behaviors, what are the kinds of things you're likely to work on in a therapy session?
It depends. Oftentimes, what we'll work on, or what the plan will consist of, is communication goals, helping children or individuals advocate for themselves, communicate their needs effectively. Oftentimes, behaviors are exhibited because that communication isn't there necessarily. So they have to learn and be reinforced by their environment that their words, their communication can be reinforced, right? So oftentimes I'll talk to families about, we have to ensure that if we want this behavior to increase, right? And behavior always behavior is any person. Behavior is communication. What I'm doing with you right now, Areva, right? That's behavior. And yes, there's those maladaptive behaviors. So we have to identify what are the maladaptive behaviors that are intervening in this person's life to access their environments, right? Accessing help, accessing support, or accessing their environments. And what can be done is you work on decreasing those behaviors, but then you teach a behavior that can help them access what they want without them having to exhibit these behaviors. And in order for them to access, families and educational providers and other mental health providers have to understand that you have to reinforce the behavior more often than not to help them understand that if you engage in these behaviors, you will be reinforced.
So my producer Robert has a really great question. He says, can a behavioral plan have as a part of it how to engage with police officers? Like, can you teach a kid with autism, like, Black families frequently or routinely teach their Black sons, if you get stopped by the police, this is what you have to do. You have to make sure they see your hands. Don't talk back. Don't make quick movements, because they know the chances are if they do any of those things, they can be shot. Can you teach a individual on the autism spectrum some of those same behaviors? Like, if you are confronted by a police officer, or if a police officer shows up in your house, you should do these types of, exhibit these types of behaviors.
Yes, definitely. What we've worked in the past is on how to interact with medical professionals. There are children who are very scared of going into the medical facilities. Yes, we teach them how to interact in classrooms and interacting with law enforcement. Unfortunately, for children in the communities of South Los Angeles and Compton, it should be a program that needs to be worked on or developed on. It's unfortunate that we have to teach our children how to interact with law enforcement. And I'm not sure if law enforcement officers are taught how to deal with children in the spectrum, or individuals that have behavioral needs. So yes, that's definitely something that can be added into the program. Of course, what we always have to look is, what are the prerequisite skills? Do they know who a police officer is, right? Do they know how to interact? So to teach those prerequisite skills prior to helping them interacting with police officers can also be something that can be done as well.
Yeah, that's really important. And again, unfortunately, but if you are Black or brown and you live in a certain community, not just in California, but throughout this country, you may have more encounters with police officers than kids who live in different kinds of communities. And a part of what we have to do as healthcare providers and as advocates is make sure that our children, our kids, our individuals on the autism spectrum have those kinds of skills to know how to engage with law enforcement. And by all means, we've got to figure out a way to make sure that law enforcement has a lot more training. And, I think Dr. Hansen put it best. They're just not equipped to deal with these situations. And we need a system in this country where you're not calling law enforcement if you're in the throes of a mental health crisis, but there are professionals that can respond, and not in 4 hours, as she said, this 998 system works, but in some timely fashion, because there are just too many cases. By some accounts, 20, 30, 40, 50% of all police shootings involve people that have some kind of mental health crisis. And, we just kind of go through the motions. We express disheartening feelings, but nothing really seems to change. We're going to stay with this story. Thank you so much, Marcos, for your expertise and your insights.